Hi, my name is Brennan Jackson and I'm a certified flight instructor at the University of Oklahoma. Welcome to the university's Max Westheimer Airport, which is home to our School of Aviation Studies and our fleet of 21 training aircraft. Today we're going to learn a little bit about how to pre-flight an airplane, which is something we do before every flight, so it's important to know. So as a flight instructor here, I get to instruct students every single day in pretty much all of our aircraft. My students range from student pilots who are out there seeking their private pilot certificate or private pilot's license, all the way up through instrument ratings and single and multi-engine commercial ratings and flight instructors. It's one of the most rewarding jobs you could ever have. It's a lot of fun. I get paid to come out and fly airplanes every day and watch students get to learn how to fly them too. Pre-flighting an airplane is a very important thing, and it's something that a pilot should do before every single flight they ever take. And it's actually the very first thing students here learn how to do is pre-flight their airplanes. So today, we're gonna go over how to pre-flight our Piper Cherokee here. It's a PA-28-161. That means it's a Piper Cherokee model with a 160 horsepower engine. This particular one is called the Warrior 3. And it's what the majority of our fleet is comprised of. This is what our students learn how to fly on, so it's what we're going to teach you how to pre-flight here today. So a pre-flight is something that every single pilot does before every flight they ever take, all the way up from a student pilot on their very first lesson up to an airline pilot. Pre-flighting an airplane is very important because an airplane's not quite like a car. If something goes wrong with this, I can't just pull it over to the side of the road and try to figure it out, right? So pre-flighting an airplane is essentially making sure that the airplane is not only legal but safe to fly before you even start the engine or leave the ground. When you're a student pilot and you're flying maybe solo by yourself or with your instructor and it's just the two of you, you owe it to yourself and to your instructor to make sure that the airplane is safe to fly, safe to get you off the ground, finish your lesson, and also get you back. But when you're later on in your career and you're starting to fly bigger airplanes with your family or maybe strangers, people you've never met on board, you also owe it to them to make sure that the airplane is safe for them to be on and is going to get them from point A to point B. Pilots live and die by a checklist. We live, breathe, eat, sleep, everything that's on a checklist. Checklists help us make sure that we've done everything that's important to do in the airplane. We're not doing everything by memory, which might cause us to skip or accidentally forget something that we should have done that we haven't done. So today we're going to use a pre-flight checklist to do this. And the very first thing we're going to do, according to the checklist, is climb up in the cockpit and take a look there. So when you're getting up on one of these airplanes, there's a step back here that I'm going to put my left foot on, use my left hand to grab this handle, and just pull myself up onto the wing. Once we get on top, we've got a top latch that we want to make sure is open. Bottom latch will go ahead and open, and now we'll climb in and start with our pre-flight. All right, so now that we're inside the airplane, we'll go ahead and get started with the cockpit portion of the pre-flight check. Again, looking at our checklist, we can see the very first thing on the list is aircraft documents. So this is one of the, there's many acronyms that pilots use to remember different things throughout aviation, and this one is AERO. There's 4 documents that we need to have on board the airplane every time we want to fly it. We use AERO to remember that. The A is going to be Airworthiness Certificate, which is going to be on our back wall here. The registration after that, the Operator's Handbook, which is in the back seat, and the Weight and Balance, which is in the Operator's Handbook. Now we'll move on to the Avionics Master. We want to make sure that it's off. Parking brake is set. So I'm going to reach down here, pull the parking brake, and push the button to set it. It's now set. I'm going to check and make sure that all of my electrical switches are off, and they are. Magneto switch, I can check over here at the key, make sure that it is all the way off to the left. Mixture is going to be idle cutoff. Master switch, go ahead and turn it on. Now I'm going to check in here. Now that we have electrical power, my gauges are working, and I'm going to make sure that we have enough gas. So in this airplane, there's 2 fuel tanks, one in the left wing, one in the right wing. I can see that the left and right wing both have 24 gallons of fuel in them, so that's plenty. Next thing I'll check is my Enunciator Panel. That's this panel up here that's going to give me any kind of warnings or cautions that I need to be aware of, any equipment failures with the airplane. We can test to make sure all the lights work by using this black button, pushing it, and we see that all the lights come on, so they're all working. Now we'll get out of the airplane and check and make sure all of our exterior lights work. All right, so now that we're outside of the airplane, we're gonna check all of our exterior lights. So lights have a big meaning to pilots. There's 3 lights on each wing that we're gonna take a look at and just make sure they're working. First one is the rear-facing white position lights. We can see that it is on, it's solid. Right outside of that, we have our flashing strobe. And up front, we have our green, because this is the right wing, our green navigation light. Now we'll move on to the front of the airplane, check our landing light. This is what's going to light up the runway if we're trying to land at night. Also help towers see us at night when we're coming in to land. And on the left wing, we have a red navigation light, and then the same 2, the strobe and the position light that we already saw on the right wing. While the battery's on, and I'm walking back this way, I like to check the stall warning horn right here because the battery's on right now. All right, we're back inside the airplane now, so continuing on with our checklist, we see the next thing we're going to check is our flight controls. Here's our yoke right in front of me. We've got dual flight controls, so when I turn the left one to the left, you can see the right one also moves, and vice versa when I go to the right. So I like to use a thumbs up method when I'm teaching students to check the ailerons. Ailerons out on the outboard part of the the trailing edge of our wings are going to be what's affected by rolling the yoke left and right. So using the thumbs up method, if I turn to the right, my thumb is pointing to the right, so I expect to see the right aileron up and the left aileron down. When I roll to the left aileron is now up and the right aileron is down. Next, we're going to check our flaps, which are also on the trailing edge of our wings, but they're on the inboard section. And we've got a flap handle that operates these right here. We've got 3 flap settings that we're going to check: 10 degrees, 25 degrees, and 40 degrees of flaps. We just use the black handle to pull it up. To release the flaps, we're going to push this top button, back to 25, back to 10, and back to 0. If you can imagine, flying the airplane would be pretty difficult if you had to hold 20 or 40 pounds of force on the yoke the entire time. So to help relieve those control pressures, we have what's called trim installed in the airplane. To control the trim, we use a wheel which is between these 2 seats. So you can see right now it's on neutral, that's where we would want it. But if I was having to hold forward pressure on the yoke, let's say I'm flying along and to stop the airplane from climbing, I've got to hold forward pressure on the yoke. That gets pretty tiring. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this trim wheel and I'm going to roll it in the direction of my force. So I'm pushing forward. I'm going to roll the trim wheel forward, and these pressures are going to start to relieve themselves. Once the airplane is what we call all trimmed out, I should be able to let go of the yoke in flight and the airplane will hold altitude pretty well. We've got the same kind of trim device on our rudder, which controls our yaw to the left and the right, and we control that trim down here using this wheel. Essentially the same principles. There's a neutral, and then we can also turn this wheel to the right or to the left. Last thing we're doing inside is making sure that our windows are clean. Pilots should be looking outside of the window 85% of the time, looking inside at the instruments 15% of the time when you're flying what's called VFR or visual flight rules. It's up to us to see and avoid other airplanes, and it really helps us in doing that if we have a clean windscreen. So if you look up and you notice any bird droppings or bugs or anything that need to be cleaned off, your pre-flight's a really good time to get that done. And now moving on, we'll go ahead and step outside of the airplane and start on the right wing pre-flight checklist. All right, so the first thing we're going to check here on the right wing is just the surface of the wing itself and make sure that it's clear of any ice, snow, or frost. Airplanes require a smooth airflow over the top of the wing in order to remain in flight and create enough what we call lift to support the airplane while it's flying around. So any kind of small frost or ice on the wing will really destroy that smooth airflow and might cause us to not be able to fly. Next thing we're going to do is check the flaps. So here's our right flap, and we can kind of make sure that the hinges aren't loose or anything. We don't see any kind of mechanical misconnections or whatnot. To control the buildup of static electricity in the wings, we've got what's called static wicks. So we've got 3 of them on the trailing edge of the wing that we just want to make sure aren't loose, aren't hanging. They're attached the way that they should be. Now we're on to the right aileron. This is what we were controlling with the yoke. So if you can see through the window at the yoke, when I pull up, this yoke is going to turn to the right. When I push down, it's going to turn to the left. And if you can see through the window, as I move this one, the left wing aileron will move in the opposite direction. So we just want to make sure that we don't see any missing screws or rivets, any dents, dings, cracks, anything in the skin. The hinges have their pins in them, and that the airplane can support my moving the aileron. Now we're on to the wingtip. Again, we're just going to check for any dents, dings, scratches, cracks, anything that we wouldn't want to be there. We've already checked these lights, but now that they're not flashing at us, it's a good time to make sure they're not cracked. All right, now moving on to the leading edge of our wing. We're just checking to make sure everything's smooth, everything looks like it's supposed to, nothing is missing. And we're going to come down to check the fuel in our airplane. So again, unlike a car, if something's wrong with the gas in this airplane, we can't pull over and try to figure out what's going on. So we need to make sure that the gas is the right grade and doesn't have any sediments or anything in it before we take off. And we do that by what we call sumping the fuel tanks. So I'm down here at the very lowest part of the fuel tank, and I'm going to take this cup and get some gas out of the tank itself, and it should be blue. So I can see here next to the white background of the wing that this gas is blue. That means it's 100 low lead avgas, which is the kind of fuel that we want in this airplane. We don't want anything else really. And I can also hold it up and shake it around a little bit to make sure that there's no dust or debris that's gotten into the fuel, and also no water. So water is heavier than avgas, and if there were to be water in this cup, since it's heavier, it would sink to the bottom, and we'd be able to see pretty immediately that there's some water that's gotten into our fuel tank. All right, the next thing we're gonna do is check our fuel supply. So we can do that a couple of different ways. Number one, we already checked inside the airplane and we saw that it's telling us we've got 24 or 25 gallons in the right and the left tank, but gauges can be wrong and your eyes typically don't lie to you. So we always check visually to make sure that we've got the amount of gas that we think we do. So we'll take this gas cap here, screw it off, and right off the bat I can see that this gas tank is full, so we're good to go. Another component of the fuel system that's really important to check is what's called a fuel drain or a fuel vent. So if we look right here, we can see there's this little piece of metal hanging down, and essentially this allows air to get into the fuel tank when it needs to, and it also allows excess fuel to drain out of the tank. So you can imagine when the gas gets sucked into the engine, it has to be replaced by something. If there's not an air inlet here to replace that empty space in the tank with air, the tank would crumple on itself, or it probably wouldn't even create a vacuum strong enough to get fuel to the engine in the first place, so the engine wouldn't run. So it's really important that this fuel vent or fuel drain is open, it's not clear, there's no wasps that have gone in there and created any nests or anything like that. So I can see that this hole is not blocked, and we're good to go on that. All right, the next thing we want to check is the tire tread. Tire itself, make sure that it's got enough tread on it, make sure that it's full of air. There's no bald patches where somebody slammed on the brakes and there's no tread anymore. So we can see this one's got very good tread on it. Looks like a fairly new tire because all these little stubs are still here, and it is plenty full of air. Moving on to the other side of the tire, we've got our brake disc. So we just want to check that, make sure there's no hydraulic fluid leaking anywhere. The brake disc doesn't have any cracks in it. It isn't worn down to where it's super thin. We've still got a good amount of brakes on us. We also want to check the strut, which is this silver piece of the airplane that's sticking out. And we just want to make sure that the strut has enough air in it to keep the airplane up off the ground. The strut's not collapsed on itself. So we like to say that we want to see about a fist width of silver sticking out on each strut of the mains. So this one's good. Moving up right here, we have our fresh air inlet. This is very important, not to the airplane itself in terms of whether or not it'll fly, but to the comfort of everybody inside. In the middle of summer in these airplanes that don't have air conditioning, you really want to make sure, again, that no wasps have gone in here and created a nest or something that's going to block getting fresh air into the cabin. Moving on to the nose section of the pre-flight checklist, first thing we want to do is take this right engine cover off so we can look inside at the engine, make sure everything's going all right. So to do that, I'm going to go ahead and unlatch these. open up the engine here. And once we're on the inside, there's a few things that we want to check, but mainly we're looking for any oil leaks. So there's no oil leaks around on the inside of this engine. I don't see any loose wires or lines. We've got our spark plugs to each of the cylinders, two to each of the cylinders, primer lines, magnetos, batteries connected. Again, nothing appears to be out of place. Last thing we want to check in this one is the amount of oil we have in the engine. So it's a dipstick just like a car, and I can see that this airplane has about 6.5 quarts of oil, which is plenty to go fly. And when we're done, we just latch it right back. Now we'll keep walking around to the front and check out the propeller and spinner. Here's our spinner. We really just want to make sure that all these screws are attached and in tightly. There's nothing that's loose or missing. Without this piece of equipment that we call the spinner here, this propeller would essentially just be a flat plate into the relative wind of the airplane, which is not very aerodynamic. So we slap this spinner on it, makes it much more aerodynamic and takes out a lot of drag. To check the prop, we usually like to run our hand over the back side of the prop, noting that if you feel any nicks or dings or anything like that, then there might be an issue with the propeller and you might want to check it out. Make sure you don't go fly with a prop that's cracked or nicked up too poorly. This one feels good. We'll now check our lights. Again, we already checked it when it was on, but now that it's not shining right at us, I can look at it and make sure there's no cracks or anything. We've got a fresh air inlet down here that no wasps or birds have gotten into to create nests. And now I can look at our tire and strut for the nose gear as well. This front tire, again, looks like it has good tread, no bald spots, full of air, and there's plenty of strut exposed. Now we're moving on to the left side of the engine. Again, we're just going to unlatch this cowling and open it on up. And we're looking for the same stuff on this side of the engine: loose wires, loose lines, oil leaks, anything like that. I can see again that our primer line is connected. We've got 2 cylinders on this side. This is a 4-cylinder Lycoming engine. So we've got 2 on this side, 2 on the right. They're horizontally opposed, so they're in line with one another. And each cylinder has 2 spark plugs running to it, one on the top, one on the bottom. So I can see that those are in line, nothing is loose. And one important thing we're going to check on the left side is the brake fluid. Without this, our brakes wouldn't work properly, and I can peek in and see that there is brake fluid up to this fluid level line. All right, so now we're done with the left side. We'll go ahead and latch it up and move on. All right, just like we did on the right wing, the engine also gets fuel running through it, and at the lowest point in the engine we have what's called the gasculator, which is another sump where we can check the fuel and just make sure that there's no water or sediments or anything that have actually made their way into the engine. All right, next on our checklist is going to be the left wing checklist, which is exactly the same as the right with 2 exceptions. Number 1, on the left side is where we have all our stall warning vane. This is what we checked when the battery was on and we were checking the stall warning horn. So we've already checked to make sure that that works. And now moving under the wing, we have our pitot mast, which we want to take this cover off. And we're gonna, when we do this, expose 3 holes that are on this piece of equipment. Number 1, we take in ram air here. This is what activates our airspeed indicator. There's a drain for that ram air at the bottom. And on the back, we can read static air pressure, which is gonna give us readings for our altimeter and our vertical speed indicator. All right, so again, left side, we're gonna check the ailerons, the static wicks, the flaps, just like we did on the right. We can check and make sure that our GPS and communications and navigation and emergency locator transmitter antennas are all secure. They're not hanging off or anything. Now we'll move to this fresh air cabin inlet that we just want to make sure, again, no wasps have gotten in there and made any nests or anything that's going to block that. And then we'll move to the empennage, or the tail of the airplane. So now that we're here, again, we're just going to check the leading edge for any dents or dings. That's where you're going to find those on an airplane, is on the leading edge of the wing and the tail surfaces. Going to come around and make sure that the static wicks, of which there are again 3, 1, 2, 3 on the tail, are not hanging off or loose or anything. Looking for missing screws or rivets. We don't see anything like that. So now we'll go ahead and lift the tail. Now, since this entire piece moves, it's not what's called an elevator on like a Cessna, it's called a stabulator. So the entire piece moves, unlike a Cessna, which we can show you because we've got one, where only the trailing edge moves and the front part is stationary. This whole piece moves. This right here is our what we were controlling with our trim wheel inside. So this is what's going to relieve the pressures that the pilot has to hold on the yokes once the trim is set properly. I usually like to pick the tail up and peek inside, make sure this mechanical linkage down here is the way it's supposed to be, and then push it back down, and again check this tail cone for any missing screws or dents or tail strikes, which happen sometimes in training airplanes. Make sure that the tail's in good condition. We'll also check the rudder while we're back here, essentially looking for the same stuff. We're not going to move the rudder like we would the stabulator, but we could just check it visually to make sure that it's good to go. And finally, the last thing on our checklist is just to walk around the airplane. So we've been up close and personal with this airplane for the past 10 minutes or so, and we've seen it up really close on a microscopic level, but now we want to take a step back and walk around and see the things that we might not see up close, like any puddles that might be under the airplane, or maybe the airplane's sitting lopsided, one strut's higher than the other, so on and so forth. This airplane looks good to go. I know this is probably going to wind up being a longer lesson, and it felt like it was a lot like you're drinking from a fire hose, I know, but I promise you, once you've done this hundreds and hundreds of times, pre-flight should probably take anywhere between 5 and 10 minutes. So it's going to be a lot quicker. You're going to develop what we call a flow, which is where you can just walk around the airplane. You have memorized what you need to do, but you're still using your checklist to make sure that you do everything that you should. And like I said, it winds up being pretty quick. Thank you again for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit how to pre-flight our Piper Cherokees here at the University of Oklahoma's School of Aviation Studies, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your camp.